Hola, muy buenos días a todos. Good morning to everyone. I'd like to welcome you to the talk that we have today with the World Energy Council Chile and Robert Armstrong from the MIT Energy Initiative, MITI. My name is Lee Ullman, and I am the Senior Director of the MIT Latin America office. Throughout this pandemic, we have been doing webinars in all different areas and fields, but I believe energy is probably one of the most important. Energy is the key to an equitable future for all, and it is one of the most important issues for Latin America going forward. All of the problems, all of the debates that are happening across the region, without energy, there would be nothing. So I wanted to give a few house rules for this talk. On the bottom, you will see that there is a chat. So if you have any comments to each other, please use the chat. But if you want to ask questions to either Bob, to Lourdes, to Trinidad, please use the question and answer on the right, the Q&A, and you're also able to upvote. Before I pass the mic over to Trinidad, I would like to thank Jacqueline Paris from Global Programs and Soledad from WEC for helping organize this talk. And as always, it's a pleasure to be working with WEC and their partner institute. So without further ado, Trinidad, all yours.
Thank you, Lee. Buenos días a todos. Good morning, everybody. We give you a warm welcome to this 5th Energy Talk with Chile, which we are carrying out in collaboration with MIT. We thank them for the platforms, for all the organization, and for all we are using today, and also for the excellent willingness to carry out these joint activities with us. As we anticipated in our invitation, this activity will be carried out in English since our speaker uses this language. At the World Energy Council nowadays, we are very happy and excited because this past week we had our Energy Week. This is an annual congress where we share visions from all regions of our planet and get to know the vision of different experts and relevant topics for our sector through global plenaries, regional perspective sessions, one-on-one interviews, and networking sessions. And today we come to share with our outstanding guest, Professor Robert Armstrong, who kindly accompanies us in this meeting. Thank you very much for being with us today, Robert. Also, during this activity, we will be sharing with the support and moderation of Lourdes Oliva. Lourdes is a Chilean chemical engineering with a master's degree in energy systems. She has specialized in development of large-scale renewable energy projects. Currently, she works as a business development partner at ENGIE, a global energy company, and she's an ambassador of our program, Women in Energy, WEC Chile. She's passionate about clean energy, transitioning to a more sustainable energy generation and consumption. And always she's embracing new challenges, as the one she will do today. Very welcome, Lourdes.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Trinidad. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about such an interesting topic as energy transition and how we can make better decisions as maybe as citizens and as nations. So really looking forward to it. And I also wanted to share some good news on our side from Chile. We got some news last week from our Energy Ministry regarding the percentage on participation on renewable energy on our energy generation matrix. We got a 20.3% average from January to September, which is the goal that we set for the country for year 2025. So we're very excited and happy about that because we're certainly moving forward and faster into the energy transition, into a more sustainable and cleaner energy system. So that is some good news from our side. I hope that Professor can share some good news also with us. And as Trinidad mentioned, we will be talking with him today. As you all know, he's a professor on the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and he directs the MIT Energy Initiative, the MIGHTY, as you call it. This is an institute-wide initiative that links science, policy, and technology to transform the world's energy systems. He's also a member of the MIT study group on the future of natural gas and solar energy. He advises teams that produced the MIGHTY's most recent report, The Future of Nuclear Energy in a Carbon-Constrained World, and Insights into Future Mobility. He also co-chaired the MIT new study, which I think we are all looking forward to it, The Future of Storage. And he also co-edited the book Game Changers, Energy on the Move, with the former US Secretary of State, Robert Schultz. So thank you very much, Bob, for being here today with us, for taking the time, and welcome.
Good. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And it's a pleasure to be with you, at least virtually, and have this chance to talk to you and engage around really some of the world's great challenges. Certainly bringing energy to people who need more access to it for increases in standard of living and economic development, as it's already been mentioned. While doing that, at the same time addressing the challenge of climate change that's clearly front and center with us today. We're sort of blessed these days with a lot of challenges, and certainly energy, climate, that nexus is one of the big ones that we face. So what I'd like to do is spend the little bit of time we have together this morning talking about the challenge and how do we think about pathways to meeting that challenge. So both in getting the energy to people that they need, and at the same time doing that in a way that we can quantitatively analyze impacts on climate change. So I'm going to share my screen with you. Let's see. Can everybody see that? Okay.
Looks good, Bob.
Okay.
Yes.
So what I'm going to talk to you about is making better decisions for the energy transition. And I'm going to start with just a couple of slides that look at the framing of this in terms of the climate challenge that's in front of us, and look at the growth in global CO2 emissions, or as we start to seriously address how do we get to the Paris Agreement goals of 1.5 degrees, preferably, or at least 2 degrees centigrade by end of century, the decrease in CO2 emissions. So this slide is one we just recently put together, looking at gigatons of CO2 emission versus a decade in these two different scenarios. And what you see is that in order to get to either one of these goals in an economically efficient way, we're going to need to go negative in emissions, net negative by 2060 or so. So by mid-century. We'll need to be deploying negative emissions technology certainly well before that in order to be ramping those up to get to negative 10 gigatons a year emissions by 2100. That use of negative emissions technologies is global, and I'll illustrate that here by looking at CO2 emissions, so that previous graph, but split across different parts of the world. And you'll see in each one of these charts, the 2 degree and the 1.5 degree, a different set of countries represented. So the developed world, the other G20 countries, which typically would have China and India included, but for the purposes of seeing their impact, they're broken out as separate countries, and then the rest of the world. And what you notice is that in the 2-degree scenario, we start to deploy negative emissions technologies in a serious way certainly by 2050, 2055. And there's significant negative emissions technologies in this developing economies part of the world. We'll also see, perhaps because of the developed nature of the world and the capacity to deploy some fairly expensive early technologies, the developed countries will have modest use of negative emissions technologies. We also project India to have negative emissions technologies. To get to a 1.5-degree scenario, though, we're going to need to have negative emissions throughout the world. And you'll see that in the right-hand graph in the developed under G20, China, India, and the rest of the world sections. Associated with those emissions curves are prices on carbon. These results were obtained, as you can see in the bottom left of the graph, courtesy of Sergei Paltsev at MIT, through an integrated assessment model that he's the author of, called EPA, Emissions Prediction Policy Analysis model. It's a multi-region, multi-sector economic and climate model. And it drives those curves to get to 1.5 and 2 degrees that we saw in the previous 2 slides by looking at what price on carbon is necessary to get there. 2 sets of curves on this plot. One is, well, actually 3 sets. The one in black, the BAU, business as usual, you can't see because there's no price on carbon. So it's the horizontal axis in this plot. The other 2, the interesting sets of curves, are the purple curves and the green curves. The purple curves are without negative emissions technologies. The green curves are with negative emissions technologies. And we represent those negative emissions technologies here with a method called BECCS, or bioenergy plus CCS. So we'll grow biomass, burn it to make electricity, say, capture the CO2 and sequester it. What you see is that if you don't have the negative emissions technologies available to you, then in order to hit the 2-degree and 1.5 degree goals, requires very high prices on carbon. So upwards to $3,000 a ton and beyond for 1.5 degrees, greater than $2,000 a ton for 2 degrees centigrade. That's going to be very difficult. It's hard to imagine that we can get that kind of agreement globally. On the other hand, for pathways that allow for negative emissions technologies to green curves, you can see the price for carbon plateaus out in this estimate at roughly $280, $290 a ton globally, which is certainly much greater than today, but it's plausible that we could do that, and it certainly allows us to get to our goals. I'll add that not shown on this graph is what happens to total global energy use as we go out to 2100 in these different scenarios. Without negative emissions technologies, with these very high prices on carbon, as you can imagine, what that does is put a damper on energy use. And so you actually see a decrease in energy use by end of century, 15 to 25%. Whereas in the negative emissions scenario, there's energy growth, which again, I think is really important for economic development. By end of century, energy use growing maybe 65 to 85% in these scenarios. So we're making good headway today, and I want to show this graph to make the point of where I see the big challenges in the energy transition as we move forward. We have approached the energy transition early on for very good reasons in addressing power consumption. Power consumption has been one of the easiest areas to decarbonize because at least traditional sources are point sources. You can imagine capturing CO2 from those. But we've also benefited by dramatic decreases in costs of low carbon power sources like solar photovoltaics and wind power. As we've done better and better there in the power sector, we're seeing the need and the necessity of taking the decarbonization of the power sector and moving those successes over into other parts of the economy. So industrial energy use in transportation, in residential energy use. A very simple example for transportation is in moving from traditional diesel or gasoline engines for light duty vehicles towards electric vehicles fueled by low carbon energy sources for electricity. But the full suite of this set of interactions between these four parts of the energy sector are absolutely crucial if we're to meet our climate goals going forward. So let me look at an example of how these different sectors interact and what we're trying to understand through tools we're developing at MIT and at the Energy Initiative. So this looks at the diversity we're seeing these days in how do we energize our transportation system. And this focuses primarily on light duty vehicles, but you'll see a couple of examples there of heavy duty trucking, which is an increasingly important focus in decarbonizing transportation. What you see on the right-hand side are the different vehicles that we'll look at here. Traditional spark ignition engines in the top, a battery electric or plug-in hybrid vehicle on the second row across, and other vehicles going down the list here. On the left-hand side, you'll see the different energy, primary energy sources that we can use to fuel these different types of transportation. And you see that energy source move from left to right through a supply chain across which there's emissions the entire way. So we emit CO2 in the process of producing energy. So whether that's producing oil or biomass, coal, or even wind and solar, you'll see a little gray bar on the top of those, and that represents the emissions associated with that part. There are emissions associated with transporting a resource like coal or oil to a processing part of the value chain. In this case, refining to make gasoline in the top row. Then moving that gasoline by pipeline or truck to an end user, to the gasoline pump, and then using that to fuel a vehicle. And you see a large gray bar on the vehicle or the truck, which represents the tailpipe emissions from those. So some of these vehicles are different. So the plug-in electric vehicle, the battery electric vehicle in the second row, it doesn't show a gray bar, right? There are no emissions associated with, if you look here, there's no emissions associated with actually consuming the electricity in the vehicle, which is different than saying that there's no emissions in that vehicle in its entire life cycle analysis, since we are likely to emit CO2 in producing that electricity. So what we need going forward to make decisions about the energy transition is among other cross-sectoral integrations, is how do we assess these various pathways, and how do we understand the sweet spots for driving down emissions, for providing those energy services that people want in the most cost-effective of ways. Now, I'll also add that what you choose to do here will be different in different parts of the world. So some parts of the world have had ample access to oil and gas, and they have robust systems that are economic for fueling transportation with those resources. Other parts of the world have good biomass resources, which could be leveraged for energy supply for transportation. Chile has wonderful solar resources, for example. So down on the left-hand column, you see solar used for providing power after transportation through the grid and to a charging station for an electric vehicle. So what you would choose to use and what looks best will depend on where you are in the world. And that's an important part of the tools we're developing, is to allow that sort of regional assessment of pathways. So what we've done, and what I'm going to tell you a little bit about this morning, is to develop a tool we call SESAME. That's the Sustainable Energy Systems Analysis and Modeling Environment. And I will say that we have developed now an open source version of that, so we somewhat jokingly call this the Open Sesame. So the idea with Sesame is to provide us that sort of tool that we can use for assessing and comparing different technology options that we have, as illustrated on the previous slide, so that we can do technology and system scenario analysis. So think about different future energy systems, which are important to planning the transition. What can we do to explore the implications of market and policy dynamics? Here's a study we've done with SESAME, is looking at the state of California, looking at its policy implications on CO2 emissions as it affects the interaction among different parts of the energy production segments. Look at cross-sector comparisons. We just illustrated that, looking at interactions between, say, electricity and transportation. And then I think very importantly is understanding the impacts between using standard versus best practices for addressing energy needs. And this is the chance for us to explore best practices and do some optimization on regional energy systems. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, and there's no quiz on what's in these boxes at the end of the talk. But I thought it'd be useful to give you a sense of the scope of SESAME and how it's laid out and what makes it special. A key to SESAME's utility is that it's a highly modularized structure, which at the courses level breaks down energy pathways into 6 vectors that are shown here, these vertical columns. So there's an upstream vector, which looks at the energy source that we're going to use. So there's a suite of renewable sources we could use, wind, solar, for example. There's a midstream vector. It's how do you get that upstream source to the processing step? So that could be pipeline, could be ships, could be tankers, a variety of methods for doing that. There's processing that depends on what you're trying to achieve. Could be producing heat and power for use. We have a separate vector called CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, which, given the importance of negative emissions I showed in those first 3 slides, it is a critical piece of getting us to a zero net emissions economy. Then a gate to user. So that's how do you move that processed energy to the end user. So that could be transmission, distribution lines, steam pipes, and so on. And then finally, on the rightmost column, the ultimate energy use as electricity, as residential heating or cooling, and so on. Within each one of those vectors, you can see a course listing of the kinds of technologies we include. We call this sometimes at Mighty the eye chart because it's kind of hard to read all the details here, so you don't need to. But it's just to illustrate the large categories that we have. But within a given category, if I circle this one here, wind, for example, we have 17 or 20 different wind turbine types, offshore and onshore. So you can look very specifically at the kind of wind you're using. We have multiple types of solar, photovoltaics and concentrated solar power, different turbine models for natural gas fired power plants. So there's a lot of detail behind the scenes in this chart. So what I want to do is not dive into the nitty gritty of that chart, but to illustrate what you can do with that in understanding the emissions impacts of the different energy pathways we pursue. So this is a look at results from the Mobility of the Future study that we produced back in 2019 is when we rolled the study out. And the Mobility of the Future study was focused on light duty transportation and different pathways we could pursue for decarbonizing the light duty vehicle fleet. It's a global study, so it looks at different parts of the world, urban versus rural areas. I'm going to give you just a few highlights of that here. One of the roles of SESAME in the Mobility of the Future study was assessing the emissions impacts, here given as emissions per mile driven, so grams of CO2 emitted per mile, for a number of different vehicle types. And here we've chosen 5 vehicle types of comparable size. So all of these 5 vehicles have same internal volume of roughly 110 to 120 cubic feet. The one on the left is the ICEV, is an internal combustion engine vehicle, traditional gasoline fueled vehicle. The second one over, the HEV, is a hybrid electric vehicle. The next one is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, the PHEV. The fourth one is a battery electric vehicle. So it depends entirely on electricity. And the one on the far right is a fuel cell electric vehicle. So that's a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle. The total bar size here at each of these represents the relative emissions. There's a number on top, which gives the relative emissions of that vehicle type relative to a hybrid electric vehicle. So for example, in the blue boxes, you can see that a battery electric vehicle has about 75% of the emissions per mile of a hybrid electric vehicle. Whereas an internal combustion engine is about 1.37 times the emissions of a hybrid electric vehicle. It's interesting that hybrid electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, and fuel cell electric vehicles all have roughly the same emissions per mile driven. To give a little bit more detail on these, the battery electric vehicles, of course, depend on how you charge the vehicle. What's the emissions of the electricity source? For this particular bar chart, we use the average carbon intensity of the U.S. grid, which is 450 roughly grams CO2 per kilowatt hour. For the fuel cell electric vehicle, we used the standard way of making hydrogen today, which is steam methane reforming. So take natural gas and reform that into hydrogen and CO2, you emit the CO2. So there's no carbon capture in that. So the other point to notice from this chart is that the vehicles on the left have emissions that are dominated by the purple piece of the bar. That's the fuel consumption or tailpipe emission, so burning gasoline in the ICEV. The second most largest contribution is the fuel production, so the production of the oil, the refining of that into gasoline. And then there's a bottom piece, a green piece, which is emissions associated with the vehicle production. On the other hand, battery electric vehicles have no tailpipe emissions, as we mentioned earlier. So there's no purple piece to that, but there is emissions associated with the fuel production or making the electricity. And there is emissions associated with the vehicle production, including the batteries, which is why the BEV has a larger vehicle production contribution than the hybrid electric or the plug-in hybrid electric, which have fewer batteries, less battery capacity in them. For the fuel cell vehicle, again, we're assuming the hydrogen made from steam methane reforming. There's no emissions when you burn the hydrogen. You just get water out of that. So it's comparable to the BEV in having no tailpipe emissions. It's interesting to look at what we project as those emissions as we go out towards 2050, particularly as during that time we're working to decarbonize the grid and other ways we produce energy. Right? I assume that was a question people were thinking about when I showed that previous slide, which is, well, we're not always going to have the grid we have now. It's going to get better. And what you see in this graph is that the battery electric vehicle, so the green curve, which is entirely sensitive to the grid that you're charging it with, does have emissions decrease as you go out to 2050. And that is driven by the decarbonization of the grid. Notice that ICEVs decrease in emissions also. They're getting more efficient with time. We're getting better at the refining process and emissions there. We look at here the impact of fuel cell electric vehicles and how we can improve methods of doing that going forward. So how do we produce the hydrogen, for example? A knee-jerk reaction when you see the slide just before this is that, well, if I made the hydrogen from electrolysis, that would be better than steam methane reforming. And the answer is it's not if you do the electrolysis with today's grid. It does become comparable with steam methane reforming as you get out to 2050. On the other hand, of course, if you do fuel cell electric or hydrogen production with electrolysis entirely with a renewable resource like wind or solar, then you get a much lower emissions profile, and that's the best, the lowest emissions per mile by 2050. So it is important to understand the impacts on the emissions of the vehicle on the upstream part of this system that's producing that energy. Not surprisingly, it's very regional, how you impact battery electric vehicle emissions. I'm illustrating this with a map of the US, which captures the differences in the emissions intensity of the grid in different parts of the US. And what you see is that in parts of the US that are primarily use hydroelectric for power, like the state of Washington or Idaho, the emissions from a BEV are much better than an HEV or hybrid electric vehicle because hydro is so much cleaner than the grid average in the US. On the other hand, a state like West Virginia or Ohio that gets a lot of its electricity today from coal-fired power has much worse emissions than a hybrid electric vehicle. So again, it depends on where you are, and you can break this down into much finer regions. Data available within SESAME for looking at this on a county level or sub-county level, so you can look at emissions near where you would charge your vehicle. We also need, I mentioned earlier that we also need to understand how these systems interact with one another. I mentioned the California example earlier, where we have worked to understand how penetration of solar and wind in California impact other parts of the energy system, in particular the firming function of natural gas turbines and natural gas combined cycle power plants. Part of SESAME is incorporation of the entire power fleet in the system we're modeling. In this case, it's the US. So this is the set of power generators around the US. And we can look in looking at a particular region, California. In this case, we can zoom in on the generating capacity in California, not just total capacity, but how much and where. And we can look at individual power generation stations. This is Dynergy Moss Landing power plant, and you can look within that power plant at a specific unit. So SESAME has very high spatial and temporal resolution. This is a look at the loading over all the hours of a year. I forget which year. This is in 2014. This is, by the way, a web interface to SESAME, and you can pick where you want and the year and what kind of power generation you're going to use. But I'm just showing this to illustrate the kind of both spatial down to the specific unit within a power plant, and temporal, what's the loading profile on that unit, to help us understand what are the emissions from that unit, and the fact that it has a higher emissions intensity when you run it at partial load, and it has much worse emissions when you have more stops and starts and increased ramping. So last thing I want to look at is a look at again, spatial and temporal resolution that's possible as you think about your energy system in the future. The impacts of time of day and where you are on emissions of your battery electric vehicle, depending on when you charge it. And so this illustrates, I'll take two extremes here in the US, the West Coast and the East Coast. In California, as I think you all know, and this maybe looks a little bit more like Chile, you have there's a lot of solar power generation, and of course that dominates the energy generation in the middle of the day. As a result, if you look at the emissions intensity and the impacts on charging time of day, in California, the best time of day, the lowest emissions, is by charging midday, and you do worse if you charge evening or overnight. On the other hand, in New York, natural gas provides the largest fraction of the energy midday, whereas in the evening hours or overnight, nuclear provides a larger fraction. And so not surprisingly, you're better off charging your vehicle in New York overnight if the goal is to minimize emissions. Last thing I'll show is just a look at capability of models like SESAME to integrate with fleet models. So we have fleet models in SESAME, not just for the power generation sector, but also for vehicles. This compares EIA fleet models for LDV going forward with Bloomberg New Energy Finance predictions. And you can see the EIA is, as is mandated in how they can do projections. It's fairly conservative in penetration of BEVs, the yellow at the top, and the dominance out to 2050 still of ICEVs, whereas you see large penetration in the BNEF projections. The result, though, in emissions is considerably damped because of the fact that the fleet turnover doesn't happen as fast as you might think, simply because people hold on to vehicles for 15 years or so. And so there's a significant lag time here in getting future emissions out of the system. The analysis I showed for the mobility study coupled the capability of SESAME, illustrated by this web interface here for a natural gas fired power plant, with integrated assessment models, energy economics models, capacity expansion models. The integrated assessment model being critical for those first couple of slides I showed on looking at impacts on carbon pricing, on global emissions. And of course, you can break that down into regional emissions as well. So I'm going to stop there and just remind you of a couple of key takeaways that I hope you come away from this with. And those include the fact that if you want to understand how our energy system is evolving and how well you're doing towards meeting your future targets for emissions, you need the capability to look at interactions across parts of the energy sector, between power production, between transportation use, between industrial use, which we didn't get into here in any significant way, and in building use. We've also looked very briefly at impacts that arise from standard versus best practices. We had a glimpse of that as we looked at the impact of cycling and ramping of natural gas power plants as they come online and offline to firm up intermittent renewables like solar and wind. So the question is, what is the optimal way for overall emissions to do that sort of integration? And then finally, as we develop our future energy systems, how we deal with isolated versus integrated systems, and from centralized versus distributed systems, it is both hard and essential to characterize. And to do that effectively, we have to have this high temporal and spatial resolution that's available out in SESAME. So as you can see in the graphs I gave, we have a very detailed model of the US. We can account for better than 90% of emissions in the US energy system. We're excited about taking this to different parts of the world. We're working with the IEA now in some projects in Europe and in Singapore, and it would be great to find ways to work in Latin America with some of the energy opportunities, energy transition ideas that are on the table there. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see you a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. That was really interesting, what you're doing with SESAME. all the information about electrical vehicles and that transition, which is also really important. But now we will try and answer some questions that we have during your presentation. So we have a little bit of time, so we invite you to raise your hand or write on the Q&A chat. But we had some, so the first one would be a little bit of more detail that you could give us into what would you think maybe would be best practices or how we could transition here in Latin America. And I'm gonna link that with a question from Christian Prado that says, the undergoing decarbonization process reaches the leading economies of the world, built for the last 100 years upon carbon-dependent structures, while cut some of other countries at a crucial time of their development process. How this clean energy process impacts the development of countries with available coal reserves, like Colombia, for example. So what could you mention or give us more insight on that?
Yeah, so thank you. As I tried to illustrate in the talk, energy transition is going to be very regional. And as you pointed out in your question, the resources that you have regionally will have a big impact on what's the best pathway to get to a decarbonized energy future. What you do with SESAME is step across these 6 different columns, as it were, and pick, if you pick one box from each, you basically have constructed an energy pathway going from coal, say on the left, in the question about Colombian coal, to some energy use on the far end. Could be electrifying a battery electric vehicle. So what SESAME can do, and I think the challenge here is to think about how that pathway interacts with other pathways. So certainly the first thing I would think of in terms of a coal-rich economy is the opportunity for carbon capture, utilization, and storage, right? So in Colombia, implementing carbon capture technologies to take coal production, coal emissions down to very low levels is possible. You need to be able to do sequestration. A way to do that, certainly at early stages, is use some of the CO2 for EOR, which could mesh with some of Colombia's oil resources, and that's an opportunity. You can actually migrate that EOR process with time so that you leave more and more of the CO2 behind as you produce oil, so that the emissions impact from the oil you produce is increasingly reduced as well. But I think the real advantage for say a country is to stick on Colombia is to look at how do you leverage the other energy resources in Colombia and mix that in and slowly shift away from coal, right? And so very rich biomass resources, very rich the natural gas resources. There are solar resources. So how do you blend those together into an energy system where you get the overall minimum energy emissions, excuse me, CO2 emissions? That'll look different in Chile, of course, right?
Yeah.
Since you have extraordinary solar resources in the northern part of the country, in the Atacama Desert, right? And so I think huge opportunity to see how do you leverage that very low emissions technology for electrifying other parts of Chile's economy. And certainly within the Atacama, there's opportunity not just for photovoltaic electricity,
Yes.
but also concentrated solar power and concentrated solar thermal.
Exactly, we have one of those.
Yeah, we didn't get into the details of, we use actually more energy as heat globally than we do as electricity, right? And so that's going to be a big item on the menu going forward.
Thank you, Professor. And just, I think, because of the time, one final last questions. This is from a former MIT student, Jose Cordeiro, and he asked, the IEA just released their new global outlook, you mentioned it, which still seems very linked to fossil fuels. Why do you think that they are also behind the curve? And the same with the Energy Information Administration, the IAI. Are the interests from the big oil companies still so powerful to change the forecast?
So the EIA is fairly straightforward to answer, and that's that by statute, so by law, the EIA cannot factor anything into their projections that's not part of law, right? So they can factor in existing carbon policies, renewable portfolio standards, and so on, but they can't project those beyond the lifetime of a law, right? So you'd see if there's some renewable portfolio standard or a CAFE standards in the US is a good example, right? So there's a time window on that. Once that time window ends in the law, then they have to cut off assumptions about improved emissions or fuel efficiency in vehicles. IEA is looking at a coupled economic and climate projection system in a lot of detail, and they are trying to look as realistically as they can at what the challenge is, right? And so if we are going to be using a lot of fossil fuels going forward, question is, how do you get the carbon out of those fossil fuels, right? So how might you use natural gas by converting it into hydrogen, for example, and reuse the natural gas pipeline infrastructure we have for hydrogen, if you can figure out how to coat those pipelines, right, to make them reusable as hydrogen pipelines. Right now, embrittlement would probably be too much of an issue in directly reusing the infrastructure. But the IEA has a whole suite of technology targets for trying to get us to a 1.5 or 2 degree target. And I think you have to couple that with the projections of where we're likely headed given policies.
Okay, thank you, Professor.
Yeah.
So I think we can take maybe a few more minutes extra to answer one more because we're getting some new questions. So I'm gonna go with one by Julio Garcia, which has a couple more votes on the Q&A. So he says, there are some news of producing blue ammonia based on hydrogen from natural gas steam methane reforming with carbon capture and utilization systems. As my understand, with current technology, only up to 80 to 90% of CO2 from hydrogen production is contained. So still some significant amount is released. It says between 1.5 and 3 kilos of CO2 per kilo of blue hydrogen. Is it possible to capture 100% of the CO2? What potential use or markets is there for this large amount of CO2?
So it's a great question. It's a very, very timely question. Saudi Aramco, or I think SABIC, maybe announced a tanker of ammonia, blue ammonia, that was shipped to Japan 2 weeks ago, something like that. And as the questioner points out correctly, in reforming natural gas today into hydrogen, which is then in this case used for making the ammonia, most of the CO2 is emitted. In this particular case that SABIC refers to as blue ammonia, they do capture the bulk of the CO2. I'm not exactly sure how much they did, but that CO2 is used for two primary applications. One of those is for EOR, and the other is used in making chemicals. So the CO2 used for EOR is not sequestered for very long geologic time periods. But I think the point of that example is it illustrates how you could do blue CO2, blue ammonia, because you've captured the CO2. To the question of how much of the CO2 can you capture, I think going beyond 95% probably gets to be expensive and difficult. We may get a little bit better at that. But there are ways to get 100% of the carbon out of natural gas. One of the projects underway at MITI right now is looking at how to reform natural gas into hydrogen and carbon. And the idea is to bubble up natural gas through a bath of molten tin. So the molten tin, it's molten around 1400 centigrade, something like that. So very hot. What you do in that case is you pyrolyze the natural gas to hydrogen, and in this case, you get carbon as the output. And so the result is that you get hydrogen bubbling out through the top, which you can easily capture. And the carbon, in the form of carbon black, just floats on the surface. It's less dense than the liquid tin. So it floats on the surface of the tin and can be skimmed off. And so you have 100% capture of the carbon out of that process. This is brand new technology. Professor Asa Henry in mechanical engineering at MIT is the inventor of that technology, and so we're working with him on seeing if we can scale that up. But that's one of a lot of new ideas for carbon capture that I think are quite exciting, and I think bode well for getting to our 1.5 and 2 degree goals.
Certainly, we certainly have the technology to move forward. Thank you very much, Professor, for your time, for this interesting conversation. On behalf of WEC, also for MIT, for allowing this conversation and for your participation. It's a privilege for me to have been here. And also I would like to take a quick moment to thank WEC for forming the Women in Energy program, which has been really interesting for me and for all the women involved. We can talk and discuss about these great challenges for humanity. So thank you very much, Bob, and I leave you with Trinidad.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lourdes. Thank you, Robert, Mr. Robert Armstrong, now a friend for us, Mr. Bob, for this interesting energy talk with Chile, with this great presentation and generous sharing of your knowledge. As Lourdes mentioned before, on behalf of the World Energy Council with Chile, we would also like to have a big thank to the MIT represented by Mr. Lee Ullman for the helping of Jacqueline Paris and of all the team who made this possible. So we are hopefully willing to have surprising you another time with different knowledge sharing meetings. Now I leave you with Lee, who wants to say bye-bye. Thank you very much and have a nice day.
So just the last thing, as many of you heard, Bob offered that Latin America can get more involved in SESAME and some of the work that's being done. And I know Bob is a big friend of Latin America. In the 80s, he was in Argentina. He's been to Chile more than once, Colombia, Mexico. So he's done a lot. Bob is usually on a plane, but now he's spending his day on Zoom. So it's great to have him. But I think that it's a true offer that he mentioned, how to get Latin America more involved. There are a lot of people at MITI who are from Latin America, who work on themes from Chile and other places. So please take Bob and MITI up on the offer, and hopefully we can get Latin America more involved in these models and projects. So thanks again, Bob, for your time. Thank you, Lourdes. Thank you, WEC, and everyone stay safe. Be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it. Look forward to seeing you in Chile at some point.
Hopefully.
Looking forward to it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Have a good day.
Goodbye.